Final edition. Chapter 2. Trip to Ronda. During the autumn break in 1987, Anna had a bank holiday, so I decided to make a change for her by motoring up to Ronda, high up in the mountains, the western side of Malaga province, via Algeciras instead of taking the back route through Garthin. It is an inspiring place, and we visited it many times. However, this time, on our first visit, we set off on a fine day with Ruff, as usual, sitting on my lap. The route was pleasant to drive, being undulating with many twists and turns, all the time gradually rising up from the coastal plain towards the Sierra de Cadiz, 2,000 feet above sea level. After a watering stop, we set off again, with all the windows down, for it was now getting on for midday. In the distance I saw a moving mass coming towards me in the middle of the road. This turned out to be a group of cyclists, with all their individual racing colours, creating a visual vibration, which in time the individual's form became apparent. This clutch of moving objects, which set up its own increasing tone of sound, a hum which started to affect Ruff, who began to get excited. As the pedal-pushing, side-swinging, grunting mass projected itself towards us, Ruff leapt out of the window. We weren't moving fast, so not as fast as the group of cyclists, but the meeting speed was obviously considerable. Ruff landed just in front of the grunting mass, doing a forward roll, eventually making off at a dash. I, meanwhile, drew to a halt further on up the road, leaping out to see to Ruff. The cyclists, meanwhile, seeing this furry thing shoot out of the car in front of them, swerved, some to the side of the road, and the others taking my place on the opposite side of the road. Those coming behind them knew not what was happening, but ploughed on. There was a lot of shouting, screeching, and shaking of fists, whilst I gathered Ruff up in my arms to propel myself back into the car in one bound, off with the brake and down with the throttle. We took off, by now our pulses racing, off the meter, having great difficulty suppressing our laughter, to continue our journey. This was just about one of the many incidents that emblazoned our stay in Spain. The bungalow we called La Fuente, the fountain, after installing a fountain. The construction of the pergola and the erection of the tall wrought iron gates looked splendid and gave the place a considerable lift. The gardens were now fully planted and the trees set into the lawn. I had bought 2 half-round plaster pillars with their stone bases to stand either side of the front door, which now completed the front entrance. Walter and Beryl Vane were to return to England in the new year. They were retiring to Cirencester and were greatly looking forward to moving back to England. We were very sorry to hear that they were leaving, not just because Walter taught Anna, but because they were kind, helpful, and comforting to have such kind and reliable people nearby. On the business side, Hill Samuel was sending out a director to assess the potential of the area and the viability of working from Sotogrande or Marbella. These meetings continued on and off for all that autumn 1987, and then by the early part of 1988. Unfortunately, Hill Samuel by this time had lost their way. Gradually they became less committed to the idea. Factors both within the institution and in the greater world of finance took their toll. Their enthusiasm dwindled. Kerry Packer sold the Hill Samuel company that year, selling the shareholding to the Trustee Savings Bank. Now, having the capital allowed him to link up in 1989 with Sir James Goldsmith and Jacob Rothschild to buy Ranks, Hovis MacDougall. Later, the same trio made a failed £13 million bid for B.A.T. Industries. The indecisions and the intercompany factions began to be felt. The world stock markets were just passing their peak, and the slowdown in building developments was becoming apparent. Josephine was now working out of Trevor Dine's estate agency buildings, which were 5 minutes down the main road toward Estepona. He was keen to have someone technically capable with a keen knowledge of financial matters close to his office, so that his clients could see that he was progressive and worthy of their custom. They got on famously, and contacts were being made that started to build up a client bank. It was that November that I started to plant the trees, previously ordered and delivered. One of them was to be in the middle of the lawn to give shade and to mask off the garden from the neighbours. I started digging out the hole, only to find that there was a massive lump of rock in the way, and without more ado I took my largest pick and pounded it into the rock, chipping off pieces on the edges. Eventually a split was made, which proved promising, and I gave it a most almighty whack. If I had been at a fairground trying to ring the bell, I could not have hit it harder, nor achieved a greater ringing in my ears. There was an enormous gusher of water that flew up into the air to about a height of 10 feet, soaking me, making me stagger backwards. I had penetrated a pipe that had an enormous pressure of water running through it. I regained my equilibrium in a moment to fly to the stopcock, only to find that it didn't shut off the gusher. I stood petrified, too aghast to move. Eventually my brain reasserted itself to question whether a finger or a plug of wood inserted in the offending pipe would stop it. My finger wouldn't do, as the pressure was too great. The plug, which took some time to manufacture, which meant that the whole garden by now was under water, was equally unfitting. It wouldn't stay in the hole whilst I tried to hammer it in. Eventually, by reshaping the wedge of wood, it might be easier to fit it into the pick-shaped split. It did, but to make sure that it was in firm and secure, I gave it one last tap with a hammer. This now produced what the small hole didn't, a flood to the extent that the plants that I'd just planted in floated past me. I now knew what it means to wring one's hands. I also developed a tic. I couldn't stop my right eyebrow from jumping up and down. I called the plumber, who was Spanish. It was not that my Spanish was not up to the event, but it was the panic in my croaking voice. He assessed the situation and indicated that the water was coming out of the swimming pool, noticing that the pool was now half empty, something I had failed to do in my panic. There was a great deal of teeth-sucking, rolling up of sleeves, and muttered curses. The hole in the ground was enlarged, and a channel made, and the water drained away. Now that the water was below the level of the hole in the pipe, a repair could be made. A new length of pipe was fashioned and soldered on. My tic ceased to be so violent, and a basis of calm descended. Sanity resumed. On the occasions when Josephine flew back to England, which was by now fortnightly, Anna and I reverted into our old routine. Anna's alarm went off at 6, when she came into my room bringing Ruff with her. After discussing the day's events for that day, at school for her, or if I were going to Gibraltar or Estepona, we surfaced to start our day at about 10 to 7. We both had our own bathroom, so by the time I had laid the table and prepared the breakfast, the time was 7:30. Cornflakes, orange juice, toast and tea were the normal fare. Anna's school day started off having to be at the estate entrance by 8:15. The entrance was on the main Algeciras to Marbella road. We set off at 8, Anna dressed in her uniform of dark blue jumper, white tennis shirt, tartan wrap-round skirt, black shoes and white socks, clutching her shoulder bag, which was always bulging, whilst I carried her shoulder bag, which was also very heavy. The bus was due for 8:20 and was rarely late. On those odd occasions when we missed the bus, we followed on in the car, dropping her inside the school gates, which was located on the other side of Estepona, opposite the Continente supermarket. Ruff normally got his walk to the bus with Anna, and afterwards round the roads, getting used to the unusual scents and smells. The walk also allowed me to get to know the area better, returning home by about 10 to make a start for the day's work round the house or shopping at Gibraltar or Estepona. When not watercolour painting, I worked in the garden, building a wall, planting trees or cutting the grass and tall boundary hedge which surrounded the whole property, cleaning the house or vacuuming the pool. At 4 I finished, when most of the building workers on the estate completed their day too. I made a cup of tea and then started to prepare the evening meal. At about 5:45 I returned to the main entrance to meet the school bus and greet Anna, with Ruff jumping up and down in excitement and pleasure. And then we walked slowly back home, talking through her day, arriving back by about 6:40, for her to change and me to finish off the dinner, to be served at 7. By 8 we had finished, washed up, and Anna organised her homework and prepared her things for the following day. Then we would set off to walk round the block to allow Ruff to re-establish old stopping-off points, and me, in my translucent armband at Anna's assistance, picking our way past the building sites with the torch. We would return home to play cards, whist or crib, and listen to the radio or play a disc, finally to fall into bed at 10. We didn't have a television purposely, so that Anna wouldn't have a distraction, although we did hire one out for Christmas. That Christmas Rebecca came out to spend a couple of weeks. The weather was so good that we spent some of the time on the beach, walking in sight of Gibraltar and having a picnic. It was so lovely to have such wonderful weather, basking in the heat, whilst all back home in England were struck in an icy blast. On Friday, January the 22nd, 1988, I flew back to England to help Josephine move into Hermitage Cottage, Padbury, and to accompany her to Switzerland for another conference. Anna stayed at Treverdines with Ruff. She preferred to continue with her schoolwork and keep up with her lessons and homework. I heard later from Janet Dine that Anna had fitted in perfectly, and it was a great treat for her to have somebody else there to talk to during the day. Our days were enjoyable. The routine hardly ever changed throughout all our days in Spain. Anna, keen to do her work well, sees to it that her homework is correct and complete, perhaps with the help of Walter, Maria, or Natalie, whose kindness and interests were much appreciated. Both Anna and I felt close because we relied on each other. Anna provided interesting and refreshing company, making me feel wanted and important, whilst looking after her welfare, making sure she had a good education, presented a challenge. I gave her security, friendship, and moral help. We experienced living in a foreign country together and shared the ups and downs that came from not knowing the language, the customs, the civic structure, and all those other things peculiar to a special country. Having her there made being away from England more bearable. I recognized her strengths of perseverance and motivation, and she, I believe, recognized that I was there to support, defend, and protect. From the start, when I was first introduced to Helen and Anna, we held hands when out walking, and this habit continued in Spain. The weekends, including walks to the golf course, the marina or the corkwoods behind the estate, shopping in Gibraltar or visiting friends, going out to dinner or taking in the different marinas along the coast. It was a natural and comforting habit for us both. We talked about everything, what mattered to us, about the countryside, our home, relations in England, likes and dislikes, in fact, everything. We could see the obvious advantages all around us of being in Spain, the luxury lifestyle, the better weathering conditions, and what was important to her was that she was not at boarding school, which she hated. Anna recognized that her education was of a far higher standard, and that she would have a much better chance in life completing her education there. Having tutors coming to the home helped us considerably, not just to tell her what to do, but as a welcome diversion, as friends. My tasks were to see that Anna was as happy as she could be, whilst maintaining the house, garden and cars, in a manner which I didn't become too much of a drain on the financial resources, considering that we had a base in England which needed to be maintained too. It was important to plan that there was nothing for Josephine to worry about concerning how the property was being looked after or whether Anna was happy. She had enough to do, seeing that the flow of money into the account kept up with the outgoings, particularly Anna's school fees. She had enough to cope with in a changing work environment as well as looking after Helen's interests. That summer, August 1988, Natalie, Anna's tutor, came to do her usual stint of a couple of hours. She came with an absolutely awful cough, the sort of cough that, had you heard it in a supermarket, you would either walk out altogether or go down another aisle. Anna naturally came down with a nasty throat infection which in a few days cleared up. I, meanwhile, caught it from her. As I was hardly ever ill and never had a day off work, I thought nothing more about it but soldiered on. About 3 weeks later it still hadn't cleared up. I then went to the local doctor, Wilfredo Savrinda, that September 1988, who gave me some antibiotics, telling me to return if it hadn't done the trick. Well, to cut a long story short, it didn't. In fact, I went to him about 6 times for different treatments, larger and larger doses over the following 2 months. The upshot was I gave up smoking. He then transferred me to a doctor in La Linea, who in turn passed me to Dr. Maskell at the Gibraltar Clinic. He eventually passed me to Professor Cole, who was a consultant at the Brompton Hospital in London, the UK's leading chest expert. There were X-rays, CT scans, spirometry, bronchoscopes, and heaven knows what else, telling them what they already knew, what the infection was that was causing the problem, but they couldn't stop it becoming reinfected. My chest wheezed, crackled, and rattled. I tried every kind of physiotherapy and exercise known to man, all to no avail. This reinfection went on in different intensities for over 2 years. I was told to live in a hot climate, in a dry country, keep away from dust, not to eat wheat, not to drink milk. They told me that with my condition, bronchiectasis, it was badly affecting both lungs. They could have dealt with 1 infected lung, but 2 lungs they couldn't take out. There was not the technology. This condition, other than the wheeziness, in no way prevented me to going about my daily round of work, in or out of the house. I was not particularly worried about it, and it didn't make me change my work routine. However, it was annoying. One moment you thought it had gone for good, and then back it came. In this, it was debilitating at its worst moments. It never got to the stage where we considered having to take Anna out of school and return to England. Back in England, Helen arranged to fly out during her school holidays, which gave us the opportunity to show her around and catch up on all her news. We had by this time developed the buildings and grounds to make it as appealing as possible. All we wanted now, according to Josephine, were some large olive oil pots strategically placed to complete the front of the house. On one of our show the surrounding countryside jaunts, we took Helen up to Casares whilst Anna was at school. This was one of the white villages of Andalucia that has a monastery and a 13th century castle, perched on an outcrop of rock circled by mountain eagles. This was once a favourite spot for smugglers, bringing their wares up the winding road from the coast, a matter of just over 3 miles, or further on to Gauthin by pack animal on the route to Ronda. On the way down the hill from the cafe which overlooks Casares, you come to an old donkey stable, grain store, and basket weaver's cottage next to the road. It was called Serendipity, which was declared in bold black lettering on the front elevation. The Americans, Ian and Joe Linda Craven, own the house and the grounds. Casares. The Craven property grew out of a small rustic cottage set on a hillside, with a sunroom whose flank of windows overlooked the whole sweep of the valley, built to join the dining room, its balustrade of wrought iron looking down into the lounge area. They called their home Serendipity, which I considered unbecoming for a rustic Andalusian finca, unsympathetic to the history and position of the town and cottage. The whole property sits on a crag of rock, and was a collection of parts skilfully interconnected to make a comfortable living accommodation. All the original parts of the building remained complete: cane ceilings on rustic poles, rough plastered walls, terracotta tile floors, while included the original thrashing floor, iron-grilled shuttered windows set in thick stonework, with doors studded with iron nails in typically Spanish countryside style, blocking out the penetrating sunlight. Lower down the garden is a pottery, with a studio, furnished room, drying room, and wheel room, all stocked with necessary articles of the productive potter. Further along the garden path towards the village was a small self-contained cottage at the furthest edge of the garden. All these parts are positioned in a spectacular setting, facing an imposing hill where vultures soar in the thermals above the stream flowing in the ravine below. The whole 3 acres was constructed on terracing, held up by typically dry stone walls, retaining the soil and irrigated water. Originally, the terracing would have been planted out with olive, almond, fig and citrus trees, with kitchen produce grown in spaces between the trees. These terraces, planted with numerous flowering trees interlaced with roses, banana, lavender and oleander, the largest flat area holding the lawn with its circular flower bed. On those wonderfully crisp, clear days in April, could be seen by looking down through the valley towards the Mediterranean Sea, the Rift Mountains of Africa. At night the twinkling lights of Ceuta on the African coast cast a spell of fairy lights, glittering on a jet-black curtain. All that we were to experience and wonder at in due course. As we passed the property, we spied some olive oil pots for sale. This was just what Josephine was looking for, so we stopped, and she went in to find out the price. Helen and I stayed out in the car, Anna still at school. When she came out much later, she said that it was not the pots that were for sale, but the whole property, which she was negotiating for. Helen said that was typical, and I was flummoxed. Although we were thinking of moving away from this clinical, restrictive, and English-speaking concave of Sotogrande, I would much have preferred to have lived in town, to be amongst Spanish-speaking inhabitants. I had already seen a property, for sale in San Roque, at the centre close to the town hall. I had seen this whilst waiting for Anna to finish her flamenco lessons, which would have done nicely. Still, from that day until it was ours, Treverdine and his assistant did the negotiations, including organising the survey. Back in England, Rebecca and Ruth were stewarding at a Michael Jackson concert in the Wembley Arena, the concert of the year. David organised their stewardship through a friend who has the job of filling the places. Both David, who was at university reading English, who some years later took a master's degree reading linguistics, and Ruth, training to be a florist, lived in Pinner. Rachel took a 3-week holiday to India and Nepal, returning to speak about the horrors, the life of the poor, whilst giving laudatory comments about the beautiful place. She was working for the police force in Edgware as head of filing in their crime section. Ben was then in training to be a porter at Clementine Churchill Hospital, sent me a long letter telling me all about Italy, where he had just been on holiday, enclosing 2 very good poems. Later he decided to go back into education and read for an honours degree in computer programming. It was about this time that I heard that Michael Bye had died, and that Rebecca and Simon had attended his funeral. He had been suffering from cancer for a couple of years. There was no sense of relief or thought of just retribution. I didn't understand his hardness or uncaring attitude, remembering how he had delivered his refusal to have anything to do with the children to the court in 1981, with such a damning, firm statement that stilled the courtroom. Josephine and I began to form a firm picture how we were going to plan the property in Casares, to make full use of every part, make a studio come office out of the main building and a large gallery behind, whilst incorporating a garage to the right front-hand side. There was talk of a tea-room with gallery, but that never transpired. The builders, when building the lean-to garage, were to renew the main roofs, totally refashion the front to make it look Moorish, build some posts and linking wooden railings, convert the pottery into a self-contained three-bedroom cottage, and put in some double-glazed windows in the sunroom and shuttered windows for the lounge, and a completely new hot water system linked to solar panels. All this was done using a local builder, Prudencio Gonzalez, who did not speak a word of English, nor was fully conversant with the latest methods of damp-proofing and insulation. It was such a relief when they had finished. I could call the place my own, and not have their vans and tools taking up the parking area. Whilst Josephine was out on one of her fortnights in Spain, she met Margaret Stone, the editor of Money Mail, and London at the Marbella Money Show in August 1988. Margaret Stone wrote an article which headlined Josephine as Costa Money Superwoman. This did a great deal for her image and allowed her to use the article as an introducing stepping stone when meeting new clients. By September 1988, the main house was finished and the garage was well underway. The Moorish designs for the front facade were nearing completion, and the iron bars for the windows, although made, not yet in position. The villagers were beginning to take note, and from what we heard they were in agreement with our plans, thinking the elevation design and name change appropriate. Puerto de la Cruz, the resting place of the cross. On the highest peak overlooking the town stood a large iron cross. This symbol was as much a sign of religious purpose as it was a link to town and monastery, as supreme protector. The name was the ancient title identifying the area. Individual travellers and pack-horse trains wouldn't enter the town at night, but were found lodgings at the stables. The new name fitted in with the history of the village and suited the external design of the building, now that it looked more Andalusian, Moorish. It became increasingly impossible for Josephine to work for a director who didn't understand the products or sales orientations. He insisted on opening an office in Marbella, which was not only difficult to park a car, but didn't have an imposing frontage, prominent enough to declare importance. It was all very well having a status address, but when it came to providing the service, it was also lacking. The personal touch wasn't there at all. Josephine sent a strong letter to Jim Fairburn, sales director, setting out all the problems. Anthony's music by now was going from strength to strength, and he was off to America. He'd done very well with one of his records, achieving a platinum disc, and was negotiating for a contract with Warner's for the music rights. Christopher had the house he shared with Anthony on the market, and was talking about moving to Cambridge. Helen was looking into joining a theatre group, being an assistant stage manager. Anna by now was keeping up with her schoolwork, but it was extremely difficult to keep pace with the language, managing to pass from one year to the next. That year she had to do a summer school once again to achieve her class position. I went to see her teacher, to put in a good word about her continuing the following year, and Walter Vane kindly wrote a letter to her teacher to assure them that Anna would catch up with mathematics. We were not sure what the future would bring, particularly concerning Anna, and whether she would stay in Spain or return to England to do her hoped-for university course. The fact that she didn't socialise outside school except for the dancing class was another concern, especially when it came to having confidence, coping with social events and boyfriends, becoming part of the community. The lessons at her school were proving difficult, which was totally understandable. Each student had to come to the front of the class and explain on the board how to solve mathematical problems. The Latin lessons had always been a source of worry, having to translate the Latin to English and then back into Spanish. When Josephine and I were to be on convention, Anna was to lodge with an American school friend. She lived further down the coast, nearer to the sea, so there was going to be some fine beach walks for her and Ruff. The builders were altering the house in Casares. Documents to pass over ownership had still not been signed. The owners were away in France, seeing to their new house. Our solicitors were happy with the existing arrangement that Josephine had signed an agreement to purchase with the Cravens, the escritura being scrutinized to make sure of legal position, an outright sale of ownership. We engaged a Spanish garden, Geronimo, of ancient vintage and even older tools, who was keeping the garden and terraces in shape, whilst we were not in residence. He attended the garden twice a week, for 8 hours a day, for the princely sum of £30. When, eventually, we moved in, he stayed on. The house in Sotogrande was viewed by an English couple with 2 children, who stating they would like to complete on the 14th of December 1988. How lucky we were, for almost at the same time Josephine had had an offer for Hermitage Cottage in Padbury, for completion in November. Shortly afterwards she had seen a terraced house on the green next to St Mary's Church in the centre of Aylesbury, and had made an offer. So it was all coming together over a short space of time, because that year's convention was to be held in Hong Kong, that same December, when I was greatly looking forward to. This was to be a trip into China to see the clay army and visit the Mandarin's palace. I had just finished 2 watercolours ready to be hung in the gallery at Casares, which was a bit premature because the builders hadn't finished the frontage. They had been constructing a new roof at the back over the sitting room, replacing the original poles for concrete beams. The chimney stack leaked, so that had to be rebuilt. Whilst we were in Hong Kong, we bought some watercolours. These augmented my own efforts, so that the gallery would be fully stocked in preparation for when it was opened that spring. It was all very exciting, being in an atmosphere of oriental bustle, the tall modern buildings and pulsating atmosphere, the jewel-like shoreline at night, the back street markets and stalls selling everything from birds packed together in cages that made vast blocks of twittering, trilling, chattering bird calls. On another stall was delicate ceramics and brightly dyed materials. Old women were playing mahjong at every corner. Yelling traders were selling their wares, and the incessant traffic noise was ringing in your ears. It was all very different from what we were used to, vibrant and very colourful. Now that we were going to have a gallery to exhibit my pictures, I started painting with more vigour, being goaded by having to fill wall space. All my days, when not doing the normal rounds, were spent turning out paintings. It was a very productive time and thoroughly enjoyable. On a daily basis I drove up to Casares to check on the progress of the building work and the needs of the builders. By November we still hadn't signed the contract of sale for the property in Sotogrande, although the couple had enrolled their 2 young children in the local school. The plan for their children to go to the international school at Sotogrande, where all lessons were in English. The builders promised to have the main house in Casares completed. That included the roofs and the chimney, gallery and floors. And with that in mind we organised a removal firm to move us in on Monday the 12th of December 1988, all ready for Christmas. The property, we thought, would be watertight and dust-free. I now started to design the business cards, letterheading and signboards to advertise the gallery. The builders had been there for 7 months, making enormous changes, particularly to the front of the house, linking in the new garage. The whole frontage resembled an ancient Moorish villa with an old-fashioned onion-shaped roof lines over the bay windows, with traditional wrought-iron window grilles, imposing bell tower and parapet with distinctive ceramic ornamentation. To make it simpler to stop the car on the narrow road, a useful hard shoulder in local stone provided off-road parking. The pottery was now being turned into a 3-bedroom cottage, and the doors, windows, wardrobes and cupboards were being made especially in the Casares joinery shop of local wood. I had marked all the builder's instructions on the walls in black paint so that there wouldn't be any mistakes, and it worked. All major main house interior work was promised to be ready by Christmas, so that they could start on the small cottage at the end of the garden. We could then move in, knowing that there would be no more dust and plaster walked through the living area. The garden pillars and linking wooden beams were gradually being built, which really made a great difference to the overall appearance of the garden, making it look far more substantial and secure. When we arrived back home from the conference to Sotogrande, it was all hands to the pump to start packing, making preparations to move everything to Casares. Anna had a couple of days off from school, it being a national bank holiday, was filling up all the picture nail holes with polyfiller, then packing her things in boxes, sorting out her clothes and arranging her school books for the next term. We had to move out quickly so that the new owners could move in. It had been arranged that Anna and I would be sleeping in a house in the village of Casares, whilst the packing was completed and the house made clean and tidy for the new occupants to move straight in. Arrangements had been made to eat our evening meals in the village restaurant, which made such a nice change, whilst exciting to sample Spanish customs close to. The removal van arrived that Friday, and the men started packing the prepared boxes, arriving in the continuing rain, being up high in the low on the road, and into the hills, arriving in the continuing rain. Being up high, the clouds circled the hilltops. It was cold, windy, and fast approaching late afternoon. The men, wishing to keep dry, saw to it that we moved in at all speed. That first night, a gale sprang up, augmenting the beating rain. The windows in the main house and sunroom were awaiting installation. Some were at the joinery shop waiting to be finished off, whilst others had just been unloaded off the removal van. We had no heating, which was just as well, except the electric fire in the hearth. The solar panels were waiting for Peppy to plumb them in. The electric radiators, which relied upon a larger form of fuse box, were to be fitted that week, just before Josephine flew in. She was missing all the fun. Anna and I rushed around, taping plastic sheeting to the windows, trying to keep the rain out, and these blew out almost immediately. The new roof started to drip, and it was so cold. The wind whistled round the building, causing the trees to bend over and the leaves to sweep in through the open windows. Anna started flamenco dancing mid-January at the village school. I dropped her off there in the evening so that she was in time for the lessons. It was always a bit of a rush to get home from school and be there by 7. Wendy and Bob, a pair of curtain fitters, were due to fly out from England and hang some new curtains they had brought over with them in their car. They were going to have a holiday at the same time. On that 5th of January 1989, Anthony and Libby, his new girlfriend, came for a holiday, renting the little house in the village. They were both suitably impressed by what we had achieved, marvelling at the views and the location, sampling the village restaurant fare. His record was climbing up the charts in America, reaching, by that time, number 74. The band visited Germany for a promotional tour, hiring a bass player and a drummer for the session's performance. In February 1989, we had delivered Josephine's car, which had been ordered 6 months before, whilst we were at the college farm. Now she had a vehicle for her own, which would take which would make easy take her up and down the coast from Portugal to Malaga, whilst I had mine to do the school run and shopping. Josephine's turnaround was now every 3 weeks, making more than ever she was having to maintain her UK connections and clients to make up for the unpromising figures in Spain. Josephine's sales results for that year won her top advisor status, which enabled us to go to Thailand, staying at a shoreline hotel complex with 2 suites, one for each of us. She was feted and applauded by her colleagues, having broken the then record. It was unfortunate that at that convention it was announced that Hill Samuel, a much-respected insurance company and private banking group, having a unique history in the Far East and